All right, a little different format here for the podcast this week.
What is going on?
Gonna just talk through a few things. This may or may not be as long as they normally are. We're just now getting started.
What are you doing?
So buckle in, and let's see where the conversation takes us. Enter an audio-visual experience like no other.
Underground rap editorialist.
Helping you shorten your dang learning curve. This is going to be a brief discussion on some of the requirements and recommendations as it relates to asbestos testing.
It was the asbestos in here, that's what did it!
For water, fire, damage, reconstruction, and insurance claims responses. Should be a fun one.
What would you say you do here?
The DYOJO Podcast. If you happen to be watching this, this is my book, my third book, So You Want to Be a Project Manager, Mindset and Habits for Growth. On page 225 of the hardbound version, there is the Exhibit 6, which is the DYOJO, the chart. There's two basic things you need in order to have a successful company.
Why do I want this?
Yeah.
Because I want to make bank, bro.
You need to have happy customers, and you need to have profitable jobs.
I want to drive a Range Rover.
We all, well, I guess I can't say that. I would say we all know we need to be profitable. Not everyone understands the difference between making money and being profitable. And that might be a conversation for another time. But since I brought it up, right, by nature of the way that overhead and profit, or OMP, is added to the end of an exactimate estimate, which is unique to the insurance claims process, a lot of people confuse the markup, the 10 and 10 markup, with your actual overhead and profitability margins.
Wrong, sir. Wrong.
Revenue is the income you earn by selling your products and services, right? So I've sold something for, say, $1,000. The cost of the goods sold, or COGs, is the cost and expenses that you exert to create your products or services. So if I sold something for $1,000 and my cost of goods sold was $500, I would have $500 as my gross profit, right? So that would be a 50% margin. On the other hand, if I had $1,000 that I had as estimated cost of goods, labor and materials, and I wanted to put a 20% markup, that would be $200, right? So my sale price with this 10 and 10 markup might be $1,200. But if I take the $1,200 and I minus the $1,000 and I get a net profitability of $200, that $200 is only 16.67% of the sale price. So my margin in that scenario is actually below 20%. Friends, do you ever get your butt kicked when it comes to writing drywall estimates in Exactimate?
Say what?
Nobody kicks my butt but me. Exactimate! People want to complain about Exactimate. Course with Restoration Technical Institute. Better claims outcomes through better mindset and habits for estimating insurance claims. And out of that course, there'll be a book to accompany the course. 4 or 5 kind of just real basic scenarios. So if you're keeping track, our common square foot drywall estimate is $147.20. Our common linear foot drywall repair estimate is $202.08. And the current program one that we just did was $301.16. So even program work sometimes beats some of y'all writing crappy estimates.
What you're doing is terrific. This outlet.
The DYOJO Podcast.
Folks should be listening to you.
So your net profit is what you have after all the real cost of goods and general overhead expenses, you know, the things that aren't direct costs. We hear all the time, it's the cost of doing business. Yeah, it is the cost of doing business. That's why I'm charging for it. But your overhead expenses, all those things behind the scenes that aren't necessarily directly charged to the job.
Did you pay the gas bill? Do you realize what you've done? I'm sorry. I said we bail. Okay.
I would argue labor supervisory, that's a direct cost. You need to charge. That's why I'm charging for it. I was on site with a contractor, and there was 5 or 6 of us meeting there, right? And so I was explaining, you know, in construction, supervisory is important, right? If we're not there making sure the right materials got delivered, that the crew's doing the right scope, that we're separating what scope is and isn't part of the insurance company, we're keeping things rolling. This particular project had a really high ALE, additional living expense, and so there was some value being added by the contractor expediting things, and he can only expedite it by being there on site. Now, as devil's advocate, though, if I were going to bill for that at the end of the job and say, hey, we overran on supervisory, I might look at that log entry for that date saying, you know, I had 6 administrative staff for supervisories, project managers on site on that particular day. Did I really need all 6 of them there?
Do you realize what you've done?
Or was it because, you know, the consultant was there doing a training, and really that wasn't, so there was one person there maybe related to the actual job that would be a realistic charge. Now, you might, if everybody's there learning something, doing something related to that job, you might put all 5 or 6 on there, but maybe put a red line through and show those as credits. So you demonstrate we're being reasonable. You know, we're being transparent with the activity we had on the job site, but we're being reasonable with the charges that we're trying to make. So those supervisory, a lot of people are tempted or cajoled into including that in their overhead, but supervisory, as it relates to the project, should be considered a direct cost, if you're asking me and many others in the industry. So you got your general overhead plus your net profit equals your budgeted gross margin. In that sale, the $1,000 sale with $500 cost of goods with the $500 gross profit, maybe out of that 30% is our overhead. So, you know, maybe $300 is going to overhead and $200 is our actual profitability. The only way you know what your overhead is to actually track, you know, your costs, you know, over time, and to understand, you know, you should have a goal. I mean, a lot of people have been talking lately that around 30% is a decent average.
Because I want to make bank, bro.
You know, and there's some indicators, you know, if you're growing your company, your overhead might expand as you're trying to add resources and grow into where you're headed. But overhead can also be an indication that you're too top heavy.
I want to drive a Range Rover.
So those numbers are important, but then your profitability is, you know, well, what are your goals? What are you investing in? What are you reinvesting in the company? All those kinds of things. So I remember having another conversation with the contractor who said they were getting ready to sign a contract for $400,000, but the job was at policy limits, and the adjuster told them that they short scoped. And so we went through and discussed that, and it's like the larger the sale price, the revenue, the bigger the impact can be if things are missed, from the sense you think there's more fluff in it, right? But that's not always the case. If it's a large project, you may need every dime, right? And if it's at policy limits, that means there's no more money to draw from as it relates to the insurance companies. You have to be real clear with the customer on what is and isn't covered. And if there's any supplements, change orders, or say a code compliance issue, and that policy is maxed out, that's going to be 100% the responsibility of the customer, most likely. So
do you realize what you've done?
Just because the revenue item is big, you can still lose money. A company has to make money in order to survive. Your company needs to be treated like an entity that has a certain level of profitability and overhead that are required for it to function and for it to grow.
You're like, hey, we're making money right now. Right now we're making money.
We've been talking a lot amongst restorers and in episodes and at the RIA in the pricing committee about overhead and profit, educating contractors and helping people in the broader skilled trades understand profitability and overhead expenses and properly accounting for those. And so that's, if you focus on the money, sometimes you can struggle to make your customers happy. And so what you want to do, what I argue for in the book, is training your people to make the customer happy, and then continue to train on that as well as how to be profitable. Because if you focus on making the customer happy, I believe you can find ways to be profitable and better understand that, because a lot of the things that the customer wants align with profitability. They, for the most part, they want the job done, right? And we all know that the key to profitability is getting the job done, doing it the right way, but get it done. The longer it drags out, the less likely that the customer is going to be happy, the less likely that you have leverage with the parties that are paying. Also, if you're sitting on the money, the longer you sit on the money, the less valuable it becomes. You're a bank at a very terrible interest rate. So there's an alignment there between getting the job done expediently and efficiently that syncs up the happy customer with the profitable job.
You cannot do it excellently. If you want to change your mindset and habits, it all starts with being able to do it right, do it efficiently, and do it excellently. You cannot do it excellently if you first don't know how to do it right.
In the DYOJO chart,
there's the proficiency aspect of what we do, which is divided into practical and technical training. This is where we become doctors of disaster. There's the efficiency aspect, which is planning and execution, and primarily we want to do it right the first time. You've heard us talk about speed, the scan, plan, execute, and document. And then there's the service aspect, which is cleanliness and communication. But
at the core of the DYOJO chart is safety. We all talk about safety first, but if you're not taking into account assessing the risks and hazards on the job site, and then having plans for how you're going to account for and deal with those. No job is without risks or hazards. They're always there. It's a matter of, have we done a good job identifying them and having a plan to keep our people as safe as possible. Awareness is the first part of that, and then the proper remedial measures, and then PPE is that last line of defense. A lot of times people want to boast about their PPE. That's your last line of defense, not your first. You know, your first is your job site, your environmental controls. Well, the first is the identification, then the remediation plan, then the environmental controls, and then your PPE. So some of that's covered in this book. So you want to be a project manager. We talk a lot about it as it comes up in these podcast episodes, but please educate yourself and make safety a priority.
Home of the DYOJO Nation.
One important factor affecting restoration contractors and contractors in general that are trying to do things the right way. The testing requirements. I live in the state of Washington. If you read the regulations in the state, our version of OSHA is called Labor and Industries. You go to Labor and Industries, licensing and permits, other licenses and other permits, asbestos certification, has this comment here: building owners and construction contractors both share responsibility for asbestos testing when doing work on the building. A good faith inspection for asbestos performed by an AHERA certified building inspector is required before any remodel, repair, removal, or other work that could disturb suspect materials. Elsewhere in the document, it talks about it really doesn't matter the age of the building when it was built.
On here! It was the asbestos in here, that's what did it!
One of our most recent articles on the DYOJO blog at this time,
helping you shorten your dang learning curve,
is asbestos testing requirements for water damage. And this was sparked by a conversation with a local contractor, mitigation contractor, that was getting some pushback for doing asbestos testing. In the April 2022 edition of CLM, Claims and Litigation Management magazine, the cover story of all things, this is for primarily adjusters and claims personnel, asbestos gets a makeover. Why cosmetic talc litigation is paving a more dangerous path than traditional asbestos ever did. So the author does a pretty good job of talking about some of the history of asbestos, the reality of back in October 2021, Johnson & Johnson sought to resolve more than 38,000 talc-related lawsuits. This is asbestos in things including children's makeup. I think it's important, assume first education, right? Maybe you're not aware. Can I help you understand? Episode 82 of the DYOJO podcast was with Stephen Patrick, talking about the value of using questions in negotiations and when you face objections.
Bring the DYOJO podcast firing up.
When dealing with an adjuster, 90% of every word that comes out of your mouth, every sentence, should be in the form of a question.
Ready to take on the dang world.
Stephen Patrick, the value of using questions in just business in general, but also in the claims process. One of the publications within your industry that's talking about asbestos. This is very real currently. I was at the dump. I was actually dumping some personal items at the refuse station in Puyallup, Washington, beautiful Puyallup, Washington. And there's this sign here. It says, contractors, all demo jobs are required to have an asbestos abatement survey completed per Puget Sound Clean Air Agency. We require a copy of the survey prior to disposal. All demo materials must be free or less than 1% containing asbestos. Most states have similar rules. I know I've worked in Oregon and in California, California likely being the most stringent.
You know, just so you are aware, you've probably covered this this is our IICRC S500, the standard and reference guide for professional water damage restoration. This is the 2006 version, so it's a little bit older. Assuming that some of you are just getting your start, I don't want to take for granted that you know what the IICRC is. The Institute of Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration Certification. This is the certifying body of our industry. Their courses are ANSI certified, the approved American National Standard. And so here's a little advertisement. They are a sponsor of the podcast, thankfully. And here's a little bit about who the IICRC is and what it does.
Hi, I'm Kayla, the Communications Manager here at the IICRC. Are you looking to start a career in the inspection, cleaning, and restoration industries? We're here to help. For 5 decades, the IICRC has developed globally recognized standards and certifications for the demand for professionals within the industry. We offer over 20 certifications live stream and in person. For additional information, go to iicrc.org.
Our IICRC S500, in page 14, it talks about special situations if a regulated or hazardous material is part of a water damage restoration project. Then a specialized expert may be necessary to assist in damage assessment, and government regulations apply. Regulated materials posing potential or recognized health risks may include, but are not limited to, so these are things we should be aware of even in addition to asbestos: arsenic, mercury, lead, asbestos, polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, pesticides, fuels, solvent, caustic chemicals, radiological residues. For situations involving visible or suspected mold, refer to IICRC S520, Standard and Reference Guide for Professional Mold Remediation. So safety is a critical component to help keep yourself, your company, your people, and your customers out of trouble or harm's way.
This AHERA Certified Building Inspector, the certification required to inspect school buildings, provide surveys and those kinds of things. But a lot of good can be had even if you don't plan to do in-house testing. Our state does allow it, to the best of my knowledge. But there's still a lot of misinformation about how many samples should be taken from which materials and where. Asbestos! I know in Oregon, our policy was to try to do it ourselves. Number one, for the speed. It's difficult at times to get a third party out there quick enough to do the testing so that it doesn't impact your work longer than it needs to. So it's tricky, if you're going to be requiring that and promoting that, trying to either make sure that you have internal resources or good third party resources that can quickly, get to the site and those kinds of things. We have had feedback from local contractors that are finding it hard to get industrial hygienists, indoor environmental professionals, IIP, those kinds of things, people that will work with them, assist, and be a partner in that process of putting protocols and testing together. And so that can be difficult as well, which may encourage you to try to have in-house resources. I know in some states that's prohibited.
This is another book, I believe, available to the general public, published by ehsmaterials.com. It's the EPA Asbestos Contractor/Supervisor Manual that I received at one of my courses over the years. And the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, what most of us refer to as OSHA, have established 3 sets of regulations that address asbestos exposure. So this is in specific to your responsibility to protect your workers, what you could be responsible for as an owner or a manager, or anybody in a leadership position.
I hope you like the taste of prison food.
So you've got the 29 CFR 1910.1001, which is general industry. You got the 29 CFR 1926.1101, which is the construction industry, and the 29 CFR 1910.134, which is use of respirators general.
If you go to OSHA's top 10 violations for fiscal year 2021, number 1 is fall protection general, and that comes down to even just ladder safety and even low pitch roofs and those kinds of things. But since we brought up respiratory protection as part of the OSHA rules, this standard directs employers on establishing or maintaining a respiratory protection program. It lists requirements for program administration, worksite specific procedures, respirator selection, employee training, fit testing, medical evaluations, respirator use, and respirator cleaning, maintenance, and repair. Top 5 sections cited. Number 2, the employer shall ensure all employee using a tight-fitting face piece respirator is fit tested prior to initial use of the respirator. Whenever a different respirator face piece, size, style, model, or make is used, and at least annually thereafter. So this is still getting cited. People are giving people respirators, not properly training them or ensuring that the respirator fits properly at the outset, or how to, properly test to see whether you're getting, adhesion to the face. So you're wearing a respirator, but you're not sure that it's working. So we got fall protection, number 1, respiratory protection, number 2, ladders, number 3, scaffolding, number 4, hazard communication, just not communicating, not identifying or communicating hazards, lockout, tagout. Can you even imagine? That's like, somebody's working on the power and somebody hasn't properly locked it out so that somebody can just accidentally, inadvertently light them up. Fall protection training requirements, personal protective and life-saving equipment, eye and face protection, powered industrial trucks and machine guarding. That's, you're either dismantled or disabled the guards. But fall protection general, 4,200 total violations. And then willful violations, 155. So that's just general, OSHA out there checking on things, and then people getting in trouble for not following through or not documenting what their processes are.
Most of what we do, if you do mold remediation properly, things like confirming your negative air, getting full containment, sealing off the intakes, limiting cross-contamination, getting 4 air changes per hour, so calculating whether you have the right air scrubber, air mover in your scenario. Those all come out of the asbestos abatement industry. So it's important. These are important things to be aware of. Educate yourself and make sure that you're protecting yourself and your team. And then they're good resources for educating your client on why our company maybe does it a little bit different, or why they should be comparing apples to apples when they're getting multiple bids from multiple contractors.
If you want me to take a dump in a box and mark it guaranteed, I will. I got spare time. But for now, for your customer's sake, for your daughter's sake, you might want to think about buying a quality product from me.
One of the other points of feedback we got from restorers and commenting on this was working for property owners or property managers and them saying, well, nobody else does this. Why are you guys so stringent? You know, come on, it's the 1980s, right? Those kinds of things. And if you just do even a precursory look, a review of asbestos, it's still being produced, it's still being used in products. And there's been instances where, you know, in times when our reserves of drywall, you know, after hurricanes and those kinds of things, have tapped out our internal resources, that we've gotten materials from elsewhere around the world, and even modern materials are coming back with higher than 1%, you know, levels of asbestos. So it's definitely something to be aware of, and to factor into your health and safety protocols for your team.
Let's just talk about IICRC S520 is probably one of the most recognized mold remediation standards, right?
Speaking of protocols for your team, there are some restoration contractors that provide abatement services. I don't think that's as common as people that would provide mold remediation services in the majority of our audience. So the voice you're hearing is Amy Sidlecki. She is with the Mold Reporters out of Portland, Oregon, someone I've done a lot of work with and have a lot of respect for. And she's talking about the IICRC S520, which is the AMRT, the Applied Microbial Remediation Technician Standard.
Guys, if you're out there, remediation contractors, get this book. Read it.
Yep.
Laws are written pretty much based on this standard. So when I see that they say we're going to come in and apply massive amounts of chemicals and then we're going to fog, that's not in there.
Yeah.
And then their estimate says they're using those methodologies.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you're going to quote a methodology that you're going to propose the remediation, make sure you're following the protocol.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's going to come back and bite you if you haven't done it correctly.
There's 2 points I want to make here about the IICRC standards, and I think Amy's comments speak to both of those. So first, a good question is, should you be quoting the IICRC standards, the S500 or S520, S500 for water or S520 for mold, in your contracts and your proposals?
Try to comply with the standard of care, but do not write into your contract that you're going to perform the work according to IICRC standards.
You're hearing the voice of Ed Cross, the restoration lawyer, talk about his insights into developing, being a part of the process of developing the industry standards, and what role they play in educating the restorer, but not necessarily being something that you want to 100% marry yourself to in the language of your contract. That doesn't mean that you don't follow the standards, but you need to be careful about what language goes into your proposals and your contracts. If you'd like to know more about Ed, he was, I believe, guest number 3 on the DYOJO podcast when it got started. We also did an extended article, A History of Collaboration, A Future of Advocacy, which kind of mirrored Ed's rise in the industry and parallels that with some of the development of the Restoration Industry Association. Ed, coincidentally, got his start out suing contractors, and when they were getting sued, they actually asked him, hey, can you come talk to us about how not to get sued? And now he's dedicated his career to representing contractors, restoration contractors specifically. Does a lot of good work with the Advocacy and Government Affairs Committee and his law practice in California.
Do not write into your contract that you're going to perform the work according to IICRC standards. Don't put that in your contracts. It's not going to help you sell any jobs. It's going to marry you to these thick documents. They're hundreds of pages long, and all the plaintiff's attorney has to do is point to one sentence in there that you didn't strictly comply with, and they'll be able to shout about, breach of contract in addition to the negligence claim. You don't need that kind of headache. Do not have the IICRC initials in your contract.
So the first point made by Ed in regards to being careful about the language you put in your proposals and your contracts. The second point being, I think there's this idea, I took this class, I put this note in my contract, but like Ed's saying, incorporating what you learn in a classroom environment into a real world scenario. Just because there's deviations does not mean that it's wrong. It also doesn't mean that it's right. Can you describe what you're doing and why? Does it make sense to other professionals and to your customer? Is it in compliance with the overall purview of the standard or of a protocol that's been written and agreed to? And so this is it, which is good. This is Amy's bringing this point up because a lot of people say, well, I follow IICRC, and then what they do is exactly the opposite.
As you mentioned, we're very meticulous about, our processes, doing the cross-contamination prevention during sampling, photo documentation, following published written protocols in everything that we do. So if you are doing a shoddy job, that could be a problem. I've had cases where, remediations were done where complete rescissions of houses have been obtained by homeowners after buying when somebody told them it was done correctly. I've seen real estate people lose their license temporarily. Just do the job right. Keep your bookkeeping and your records keeping in shape, and you shouldn't have a problem. And it shouldn't be a problem if a consultant, whether me or anybody else, is saying, here's the protocol, can you follow it? Yes, we can. It's going to cost XYZ. To take that protocol and then go and have somebody spray or paint over a mold problem, it's very probable that it could wind up in trouble.
Referencing another magazine from the claims tribe. This is NU Claims, covering the business of loss. Has an article on claims management. It says everything old is new again. So it is unlikely younger adjusters know about Ballard versus Farmers Insurance Group, the case with an initial $32 million verdict against the insurer for bad faith claims handling. Most people assume Ballard is about mold, and it is, but the case is also about the superior knowledge that adjusters have and failure to inform the claimant of that superior knowledge. The author talks about some of the history, the plumbing leak in 1998. I remember when I got into the industry, 2002, this was still a hot topic. Claims handling processes. There's some, and the importance of good communication. So this is actually one of the topics we're discussing in our local Washington Pacific Northwest networking group.
We're here with Rich Rye from 1-800-WATER-DAMAGE. What are we doing here, Rich?
We are discussing the great meeting we're going to have for everybody on Tuesday. I'm looking forward to meeting you.
The Fellowship of Construction Knowledge and Entrepreneurial Development.
We're having a public adjuster come in and talk about the elements that go into bad faith. I think we throw that around. So just because someone objects to your line items does not mean that they're practicing bad faith.
Wrong, sir. Wrong.
There's legal elements that go into that. But as it relates to this article, there's some things in there talking about toxic mold. I think some of us would object to, toxinogenic and those kinds of things. Some distinctions that can be made, that there's still some poor understanding of some of the elements there. But all in all, a good reminder of, the litigious nature that's driven a lot of the policies. These are, publications that you can find that are industry adjacent, but not directly tied to restoration, and there's lots of good information out there.
The other thing that I think is a big issue right now and should be pointed out is contractors and consultants making health claims. So
that make me their doctor? Yes, in a way.
Our job is to make sure a house is, normal fungal ecology, clear of water damage, clear of, mold amplification. And it's not to tell somebody, oh, you won't be sick in the house, or, oh, you are sick in the house because you have this mold. And so many are crossing that line. Unless you have an MD after your name, your job is just to evaluate the home. And yes, we get calls all the time from people because they're having symptoms. That's a good indicator. But our job is to find the problem as far as mold. And you could have a completely clear mold job, and you should not tell that client, it's clear, the consultant cleared it, you're safe to live here now.
Do you realize what you've done?
Because there could be other things, rodent problems, formaldehyde, VOCs, benzene, toluene, all kinds of problems that could be making somebody sick in the house.
Or just general house cleaning, right? I mean, how many times have we been called out and people are worried about this one by one spot of mold, behind something or another, and it's like their house is, just in. It's disgusting, right? I mean, you go.
It is, and the dust, the dirt, and the dust reservoirs. Interestingly, if the house is maintained humid, and in some environments like that, it is, you get a biofilm. So all that dust, you get settled spores, and it becomes a mold issue as well.
Well, we have a few blasts from the past. Amy Sidlecki, that's from my time in Oregon, both when I had my own company and working for a contractor to start up a restoration company within their existing company. And it's always fun to reconnect or associate the listeners with former episodes. So that's one you might want to go back and look at, especially if you're involved in mold remediation. This is the DYOJO Podcast. Our goal is to inform you and entertain you, what we call infotainment. We are self-funded. When you buy a book, we have 3 currently with the 4th one coming out, How to Not Suck at Estimating.
Better claims outcomes,
the DYOJO,
through better mindset and habits for estimating insurance claims.
Okay.
A lot of the principles are those that come out of my mediocre book, Be Intentional Estimating.
Podcast. Which will also be in collaboration with one of our sponsors, the Restoration Technical Institute, a course that will be coming out. So working on trying to get that wrapped up. Thank you to so many of the peers that have reviewed that, given some valuable input and insights onto how to make things a little more clearer, or completely eliminate certain elements of that. But through Restoration Technical Institute, I also met Office Services by Brandy Hawthorne. This just came in the mail today. If you're listening, you're not going to be seeing that, but it's wow. Keep it up, you rock. #Restoring Kindness. I know our friend Michelle Blevins at CNR Magazine is key in getting the Restoring Kindness promoted and out there. But just the efforts all around by restorers to do good in your local neighborhood. And this was a fun thing that Brandy sent out.
With friends, I like to have fun.
Office Services by Brandy is a sponsor of the podcast, along with the Restoration Industry Association, and as previously seen, the IICRC, the Institute of Cleaning and Restoration Certification. So thank you for listening. And if you've gotten this far, you're almost there. So on the topic of certification, right, we talk a lot about the new book coming up is How Not to Suck at Estimating, Habits for Better Project Outcomes. So there's certification even for Xactimate, the common tool used in estimating in our industry. So we had Brian Austin on from Verisk, from their learning platform, And he was talking, I was able to ask him, that was part of our Xactimate Sessions series, our second series from the DYOJO podcast. Well, here, you'll see the interaction right now.
Is it true if I'm level 3 certified, anytime someone rejects my estimate?
How dare you?
I can pull the certification out. Here's my certification. They will just cower.
I wish that was true.
I think one important distinction in our industry is to know that the standards, things such as the IICRC S500, the water damage standard, these are not regulatory in nature. They are voluntary. So we have their consensus-based standards, the best of what everybody can agree on that is on the panels. And if you read the first parts of any of those versions, you can see all the people that contributed hours and hours to these stellar documents, but you got to understand they are voluntary. One of the best explanations of this that I've heard comes from Ken Larson's book. I'm breaking everything here. Leadership in Restorative Drying by Ken Larson. He was a guest on the podcast, and you can view that. But he talks about standard practice. So I'm doing standard practice is a phrase used to describe practices normally and regularly performed by professionals of a trade. A standard practice can vary significantly by geographic region. They may or may not reflect competence. So I'm just doing what everybody else is doing is not going to cut it. That's not what we're talking about. Just because so-and-so doesn't do it or does do it, especially as it relates to asbestos. So talked about our standards in our industry and restoration are voluntary. Standards as it relates to asbestos are regulatory. Therefore, they're law. There's law behind them. And the penalties are, fines, jail time, prison time, those kinds of things. So up from standard practice is standard of care, is the structural practices that are common to reasonably prudent members of the trade who are recognized in the industry as qualified and competent. Qualified and competent. You've gone through some level of education and training, both hands-on and in the classroom, and exhibited that you can pass a test. So that is important. IICRC has talked about doing a better job in partnership with the RAA with creating avenues for career development, professionalizing our industry, having us recognized, our certificated programs recognized in the realm of electricians and plumbers. They have to have hours and hours of competence, under the apprenticeship with somebody who's done it. We try to model after that. The companies that are doing the best are modeling that, but standard of care is a step up from standard practice, but understand if you're following the IICRC S500, you're following the consensus. That's the baseline. That's not the end all. This is the baseline. This is where we start. This is what we all should at minimum be doing.
I was listening to all of the experts on the committee talk. This is back in the 1990s. And I realized that no matter what we were able to come up with as a scenario, there was almost always some sort of exception to it. And then somebody else would come up with an exception to the exception.
You're again hearing the silky smooth voice of Ed Cross, the restoration lawyer, talking about providing some historical context to the development of the S500 and some of his recommendations, which we talked about earlier, about how restorers incorporate the standards of practice or the standards of care into their efforts, but also being mindful of exceptions to the standards, because not every scenario can be accounted for.
And I proposed that IICRC add some language to indicate that in certain circumstances, deviation from the standard of care may actually be appropriate depending on the circumstances, because it's not really feasible to write one document that can apply to every single conceivable type of a restoration scenario. There's just way too many variables to consider. So IICRC agreed, and you'll notice in the big fat disclaimer section in the beginning of the book, there's something indicating that in certain circumstances, deviation from the standard of care may be appropriate. Standardized anything may be helpful in terms of giving us a guidance point somewhere to start. This is like the discussion we've been having about Xactimate pricing. That is a starting point to begin the preparation of an estimate. Okay, you look to the IICRC standards and give them very careful consideration. You want to do your best to try to comply with the IICRC standards. But if your back is against the wall, you want to look to this escape hatch that we put into the disclaimer to say, hey, under this particular set of circumstances, deviation from what's in the printed standard was actually appropriate. Here are the reasons why. Here's the evidence supporting it. And the way we did it is actually the better way.
So Ken talks about then there's state of the art, which refers to the highest level of general development. This is where you're continuing with that mindset and habits of growing and learning more. He talks about his book has the vision of improving the practices that are common to reasonably prudent members of the trade who are recognized as qualified and competent and elevating that. So
especially those of you that are just getting started and may not be aware, this is important because this not only people can get sick, people can die, you can get heavy fines or even prison time. So please reach out to other restorers in your local area, find out what best practices are, for your area, and then on a national level, and make sure that you're keeping yourself, your team, and your customer, educate your customer. We are doing this to keep you safe, especially a property owner or a property manager. Multifamily situation, you do not want to have unnecessary exposure just for a lack of knowledge or bad protocols in your process for mitigation and remediation.
So even if you don't plan to do asbestos testing or remediation internally, it would be beneficial, whether it's yourself as the owner or one of your management team or your safety personnel, if you have that developed of an organization, to take the course or be well educated in those areas. Because asbestos, lead, those are elements, prior to starting any work in a water or fire damage project or doing any kind of demolition, or even if you're like us on the repair side, making sure that those tests have been done so that way the site is safe. So there's the AHERA building inspector. There's asbestos awareness courses. One of the best overall courses I took from the IICRC was the HST, the Health and Safety Technician. I believe that was designed around 10-hour OSHA, but OSHA offers 10 and 30-hour training. The hazards awareness or the basic awareness is definitely recommended. The 10-hour is a great course, especially foremen, supervisors, those kinds of things. And then the OSHA 30-hour, that should be required of most managers and especially project managers that are directly involved in, directing in-house labor as well as subcontractors, just to have that additional layer of health and safety awareness around the OSHA guidelines. Most states have their version of local OSHA. I know in Oregon we had the DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality. In Washington we have the Clean Air Associations, in Washington we have the Clean Air Agencies in different regions. There's regions of OSHA, things like the Master Builders Association. I know RIA has a new, I think it's the ERS course, which talks about hazards abatement and remediation, which I believe asbestos is part of that. And most of the water damage courses now, I believe, mention that or should discuss elements of that. It's encouraging. Most contractors we talk to are well aware of that and doing everything they can, but we do get those outliers where people are saying, hey, these guys, this company will do it without ever doing that testing. They don't worry about it as long as it's after the 80s, those kinds of things. So Some education for the public and our customers is good, and then obviously education within the industry. And if you hear someone say that about one of your competitors, maybe it's a good opportunity to call and say, hey, are you aware, we were at such and such property manager, and they mentioned that, if they mention someone specifically, they mentioned that you don't do any asbestos testing. That's not what I heard. I believe you guys run a clean shop, and then obviously, if they're belligerent, then maybe you might have to take other steps. But if they're like, what? No, we test everything. That's a good reminder that you're competing with the right kind of people, right? And you want to promote that. And start with education, assume the best, and then go from there. As a way to promote the upcoming book and course, How Not to Suck at Estimating, Habits for Better Project Outcomes, I thought I'd read you a small excerpt. Setting yourself up for success. If you get past this sentence, you have made the commitment to read a book titled, How Not to Suck at Estimating. So either you are willing to admit that you, or someone you know, needs some assistance in the estimating department. If you bought this book, does it mean you suck at estimating? No, you're good. You're good, bro. If someone bought you this book, does it mean that you suck at estimating? No. I personally love it when people are able to take a word or a concept that I commonly use and expose that I've been using it incorrectly. Whether it's a book, a podcast, or even a movie, those aha moments have a way of sticking with me when I am slapped around by simple logic. To that end, one of the best books on personal development that I've ever read emerged from within our industry. Shout out to Rachel Stewart, then Executive VP of Titan Restoration and now CEO founder of Accelerate Restoration Software, wrote Unqualified Success. She flipped the idea of sucking on its head when she said the only qualification to get better, being willing to suck when you start. Maybe you don't suck, but you would like to elevate your ability to consistently achieve better project outcomes. Join the club. I'll do my best to share what I have learned over 2 decades in this industry, but understand, you are not alone. You are not alone. Speaking, I am here with you. Hopefully this episode has given you a lot to think about with regards to building a culture of safety. A lot of things go into building a culture. We wrote a book on culture with some of our friends, Be Intentional Culture. It's book number 2 from the DYOJO in the Be Intentional series. But one thing to remember is your culture is not what you say per se, but your culture is what you do. So the question isn't really whether you have a culture, a workplace culture. The question is whether you have been intentional in developing it. So continuing to educate yourself, whether you're an owner, a manager, or an aspiring professional, working to educate your team members and make the elements that you understand related to safety and efficiency and proficiency accessible and actionable by everybody in the organization. So whether you're a technician, estimator, project manager, general manager, or an owner, that's everybody's responsibility. Obviously, if you're further up the ladder or the food chain and the rules don't apply to you, that's going to affect how other people follow through on them as well. So you need to, in order to get to eliminate or close the gap on that dissonance, to bring into harmony the things that you say are your expectations or your standards, and then the norms, what you're actually doing, you know, what we say needs to be brought into compliance with what we do, and that has to be from the bottom up as well as the top down. Back to a small excerpt from the book, How Not to Suck at Estimating. Having some guiding principles around scope capture is helpful for every team member. Robert Harrell, adjuster turned contractor turned software specialist, whom I had a lovely conversation with at the Restoration Industry Association event in Reno this year, shares that there are 4 key elements of a solid scope. Element number 1, the product name or identification. Example, drywall. Element number 2, quality. Example, half-inch smooth coat finish. Element number 3, quantity. Example, 96 square feet. Element number 4, repair methodology. Example, remove and replace. In practice, these 4 elements would lead the estimator or anyone capturing project details to consistently ask 4 questions. So if you are an estimator and commonly miss items that affect your ability to write a complete scope, ... If you are a manager and your team members commonly miss items that lead to poor project outcomes, ... If you are an owner and are frustrated by low profit margins, ... It's time to create and hold team members accountable to the consistent practice of thorough data capture, TDC, which we will address in Module 3. Every day is a struggle. Quit the bitch you can give or you can get lifted.
This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
As a contractor, customers always ask, when can you get started? Well, I just got here and we don't have an agreed scope or cost. Right, I get that, but when can you get started? Agreed scope and cost, contract and deposit,